Coming up, I'll review the arguments before the Supreme Court on Tennessee's law restricting trans surgeries for children. I'll also predict how the case will come out. I want to reflect on the bitter lesson of the Daniel Penny case. And Newsweek editor Josh Hammer joins me. We're going to talk about whether Trump will get the cabinet he wants. Hey, if you're watching on YouTube or Rumble or listening on Apple, Google, or Spotify, please subscribe to my channel. This is the Dinesh D'Souza podcast.
America needs this voice. The times are crazy. In a time of confusion, division, and lies, we need a brave voice of reason, understanding, and truth. This is the Dinesh D'Souza podcast.
The Supreme Court just heard arguments in a very important case that has to do with surgeries, trans surgeries for minors, for children. The state of Tennessee passed a law forbidding these surgeries. This is not a law that is applicable to adults. Adults are able to make their own decisions in these areas. However, for minors and for children, the situation is different, and the state of Tennessee decided that you are having very impressionable minors, sometimes steered by their parents, but sometimes not, sometimes steered by counselors. And the whole game of all this is very macabre because parents are often quite reluctant. The children are brainwashed by the counselors. The counselors basically go to the parents and say, listen, you have a biological daughter, let's say, who identifies now as a boy. And so we're offering you a choice. You can either have a live boy or a dead girl. In other words, that this trans identification, you have to go along with it because otherwise your child is likely to kill themselves. So this is the emotional blackmail that is used by these counselors in order to pressure parents into going along with trans surgeries that are in some cases difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. There are all kinds of problems that come out of this, psychological problems, physical problems. And there's a whole bunch of data now, particularly coming from countries that are further down the road of this than we are. In other words, European countries that embraced all of this and tried it out and then did studies which showed that, number one, this whole notion that transitioning yourself is going to take a depressed and suicidal kid and make that kid well-adjusted and better off. All of this is just part of the propaganda and not substantiated by actual cases. And the overwhelming evidence cuts the other way, that the risks here in many cases outweigh any potential or purported benefits. However, the Biden administration, supported by the ACLU, sued the state of Tennessee, and the case went up and up and up all the way to the Supreme Court. I sort of chuckled because the guy representing the ACLU is this guy named Chase Strangio, a very bizarre Strangio guy. But it's a guy with a mustache and yet a completely feminine voice. So this must have been a somewhat, let's just say, unnerving and perhaps for several members of the court, somewhat of a freaky experience to listen to Strangio. And Strangio is truly Strangio. I mean, this is a guy who says things like 2-year-olds and 4-year-olds are in a position to know if they belong to the opposite sex or if they identify with the opposite sex. And this kind of, I mean, it's really hard to believe this is even before the Supreme Court, but it is. And clearly the liberal justices, I'm thinking specifically here, Kagan and Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, were pretty sympathetic to these trans procedures. At one point, Kagan making the preposterous point, because the state of Tennessee was talking about all the side effects and all the dangers of these treatments, and she goes, Well, aspirin too has side effects. Of course, the implication being that, chopping off your genitals or cutting off your breasts is akin to taking an aspirin. And a lot of people on social media blasted back at this and said this reflects a kind of absolute ignorance of what these procedures entail. But it shows, I think, for some of these justices who live in their own world, in an insulated environment, they tend to think of all this as a kind of intellectual exercise. Well, let me posit a counterexample, or have you considered the possibility that all drugs have certain side effects? And Justice Kagan even said something like, if 1,000 people are benefited and one person suffers the side effect, does that mean that the drug isn't worth taking? Of course, the real point that the state of Tennessee emphasized, and did so, I think, very effectively, was, listen, of course there are costs and benefits with any kind of medical procedure, but whose job is it to decide if these risks are worth it and if the procedure should be allowed? And the simple answer to it, at least in a democratic society, is the legislature. It's the legislature's job to balance these risks and make laws that ensure the kinds of medical protections that are within the legislature's power in a free society. And so that was it for Justice Kagan. And then Strangio goes on to make the point that, piggybacking on the civil rights movement, that somehow this is just like civil rights. And of course, Justice Ketanji Jackson was right on board, and she started talking about laws that outlawed interracial marriage. Again, these analogies are so far-fetched and so strange. First of all, marriage is between adults. Second of all, what is the analogy between let's just say, a white guy and a black woman, or vice versa, getting married, and a child who is either at its own initiative or in some cases cajoled by a counselor, undergoing lasting, if not irreversible, treatments? How are those two cases similar or the same? And the answer is they are not similar, and they are not the same. And Justice Alito, with his customary brilliance, absolutely honed in on this and destroyed the argument in the following way. He basically says to Mr. Strangio, he goes, is being trans an immutable characteristic, yes or no? In other words, think about it. The whole point about saying that you can't discriminate against me based on race is that race is an immutable characteristic. In other words, I can't change it. Race is given. The same thing was basis was used for laws against sex discrimination. You're discriminating against me because I'm a woman. I can't help being a woman. And so why are you using this immutable, which is to say incorrigible, which is to say unchangeable characteristic to discriminate against me? National origin. I was born in India. That's my country of origin. Why are you discriminating against me for a fact that I can't change in any way? So Justice Alito asked Strangio, is being trans an immutable characteristic, yes or no? And here Strangio basically hangs himself, because he goes, yes, it is. It's immutable. Then Justice Alito goes, well, isn't it true that there are people who have transitioned one way and then they have changed their mind and they've transitioned back? And Strangio has to go, well, yeah. And then Alito goes, well, doesn't that mean that the characteristic, if you are the thing that you identify with, if being male or female is in your mind, isn't it a fact that you can change your mind? And if you can change your mind, you can change your gender. So it's not an immutable characteristic. And I think right there, boom, the intellectual case for, or at least the intellectual effort to smuggle this in under the banner, if you will, of the civil rights movement, race, and then sex, and now, of course, then sexual orientation, and now, of course, trans, this whole thing was sort of blown apart. It's difficult to predict how these cases will turn out, but I think it's pretty fair to say, based on listening to what the justices had to say, that we're going to win this one. I think we're going to win it 6-3. We might win it 5-4. Interestingly, Gorsuch was completely silent during the whole conversation, didn't say a word. So in that sense, he didn't play his hand. But listening to all the others, it looked like Roberts, it looked like Alito, of course, Clarence Thomas is sound. He's sound on everything. And Amy Coney Barrett all seem to have sympathy with the state of Tennessee. And so I think we're going to see here a 6-3 or a 5-4 decision. And that will be a big win. In fact, I think it's a reflection of the degree to which this whole trans nonsense has now become not only publicly discredited, because you can't find even polite quarters in American life anymore where people think this is a good idea, but it's very important that it be legally discredited as well. Open an IRA in gold with Birch Gold and get free silver shipped directly to your home. That's right. It's the most wonderful time of the year, the only time of the year that Birch Gold gives away a free 1-ounce silver eagle for every $5,000 purchased. And here's the best part. You don't have to pay a penny out of pocket. Just convert an existing IRA or 401k into a tax-sheltered IRA in physical gold. And Birch Gold will send you your free silver coins directly to your home. Now, you might be thinking, why do I need to diversify into gold? My guy's headed to D.C. Things are good. Well, here are the facts. An administration trying to reverse a $36 trillion national debt in just 4 years is like a field mouse trying to stop a freight train. We have a huge amount to pay on just the interest on the debt, let alone the principal. So take action now to protect your savings. Text Dinesh to 989898 before December 18th for a free information kit on gold and to claim your eligibility for free silver on qualifying purchases from Birch Gold. Do this before December 18th. Again, get started by texting Dinesh to the number 989898 for peace of mind that lasts longer than 4 years. Are you feeling overwhelmed by the increasing cost of health insurance? Have you had enough of not having control over your healthcare dollars? Introducing ShareRight. It's healthcare done the right way. At ShareRight, you're not just a number, you're part of a caring community. And forget about paying excessive premiums. With ShareRight, you stand to save 30 to 50% compared to health insurance. Think about what you could do with all those savings. But it's more than just savings. ShareRight ensures you have access to the care you deserve precisely when you need it, from routine checkups to unexpected emergencies. With ShareRight, your healthcare is their top priority. Empower yourself today by taking control of your healthcare costs. Visit shareright.org/Dinesh to learn more and see how much you can save. Visit shareright.org/Dinesh. That's shareright.org/Dinesh for healthcare done the right way. I'd like to offer a few thoughts on the Daniel Penny trial that, as I record this podcast on Thursday midday, does not yet have a verdict. There might be a verdict by the time you see this or are listening to this podcast. And I have an idea of how I think it's going to come out. I'll tell you what that is. But let's talk a little bit about what happened and how this trial has unfolded. The circumstances of the case you probably know pretty well. And that is, you've got this unruly guy on the subway harassing, terrorizing, yelling at, disrupting the passengers in the train. And then you have this guy with a military background, Daniel Penny, who subdues the miscreant by putting him into a kind of known restraining chokehold, and it immobilizes the subject, who dies subsequently. And of course, it is part of what the prosecution is trying to show, that Penny killed the guy. That is not entirely clear. The guy was not dead when he was taken away. And so the Penny defense, in part, is that Penny cannot be held solely or even directly responsible because the guy was alive when he was placed into the care of the medics. The fundamental issue, however, is not so much that. It is rather whether or not Daniel Penny was acting either in self-defense or as a good Samaritan, preventing other people from being harmed. And this is something, by the way, the idea of the Good Samaritan, that's very important to maintain law and order in any society. I mean, there's a reason that we have the story of the Good Samaritan in the Bible, because after all, very often when there is harm done to somebody or threatened harm done to somebody, the cops aren't always right there on the scene. Someone else might see what's going on, and the question is, do you want people to intervene and try to help? The answer, I think, is of course you do, because if you don't, then by and large people will just look the other way, live their own life, pretend that they didn't see anything, and it's going to be much harder, A, to protect people while they're being assaulted, and then second of all, to solve crimes after they have been committed. So I think the great crime here is not Daniel Penny's crime at all, but rather the crime of prosecuting this man for intervening. He didn't have to intervene, and yet he did. He successfully subdued this guy. It seems like the people around him were grateful to Penny for intervening. They thought that they were facing a menace on their hands, and yet here is Penny facing charges, manslaughter charges. Basically, what the prosecutor are saying is that he went too far. Now, the prosecutor is an extreme leftist. She is, there's a video circulating on social media, which I've watched, in which she's talking about the fact that she's very proud of herself for reducing the charges of murder against a guy who was at an ATM. He was trying to rob the ATM. Apparently somebody else showed up to get their money, and because that person could identify him, or because he was stricken with panic, he kills that person. Now, if you kill someone in the commission of a robbery, that's capital murder. And so this guy was facing capital murder charges. But the prosecutor, this woman who's prosecuting Daniel Penny, she goes, I listened to his story. I was very moved by his circumstances. I felt very bad for him that he found it necessary to do this. And so, in what she calls restorative justice, she lowers the charges. The guy faces essentially manslaughter instead of murder. So think of it. This is a woman who has sympathy for the criminals, and on the other hand wants to prosecute Penny. Just the worst kind of individual, and the kind of person who is an absolute menace to have in the prosecutorial division of New York City. So nevertheless, she is out to put Daniel Penny in jail, even though from the point of view of many people, Daniel Penny is not only not a criminal, but is a kind of a hero. And we're going to have to see what the jury thinks about all this. It seems to me that there is an effort on the part of the prosecutor and maybe the judge to get this guy. The judge has allowed all kinds of prejudicial information in the trial. But as we speak, the jury is taking its time. There are some reports that say the jury may be deadlocked. My guess is that what you have is you have two groups of people on the jury, probably very few conservatives or MAGA people. The jury is probably divided between ideological left-wingers and people who just take the subway. So the people who take the subway know it's a dangerous place. There are all kinds of people there who can terrorize you, rob you, in some cases stab you, and take your stuff. And those are the people probably who are going to be more sympathetic to Daniel Penny. And then you've got the self-satisfied leftists who look at this through an ideological lens. Basically, the way they look at it is that, you know, here's a guy who embodies like white supremacy, because after all, Daniel Penny is white. After all, the guy he choked was black. There we go. It's a race. You know, it's a racist act. And so your sympathies are with the guy who was choked, and not with Daniel Penny. And so these are, I'm thinking, the two camps of people who are trying to each trying to persuade the other. So my prediction, and you'll be able to know soon enough if it's right, quite likely a hung jury, because I think the people who live the experience of the dangers of the subway are not going to be swayed, and probably the leftist ideologues are not going to be swayed either. I may or may not be right about it, but in my book, Daniel Penny does not deserve not only to be convicted, I don't think he should have been prosecuted in the first place. MyPillow is excited to announce that the MyPillow Christmas extravaganza is finally here. Get this season's flannel sheets for as low as $59.98. They won't last long, so get them while you can. The famous My Slippers. These haven't been on sale for over a year, are regularly priced at $119.98 for a limited time, are now only $59.98. And the 6-piece towel sets are back in stock with limited quantities, only $29.98. With hundreds of MyPillow products, there's something for everyone on your Christmas list, from bathrobes, duvets, quilts, down comforters, and so much more. Check it out. Call 800-876-0227. The number again, 800-876-0227, or go to mypillow.com. Make sure to use promo code Dinesh to save on all the MyPillow products. Flannel sheets as low as $59.98. 6-piece towel sets, just $29.98. But that's not all. They're extending their 60-day money-back guarantee until March 1st, 2025. Plus, all orders $75 or more ship absolutely free. It's always a pleasure, guys, to have back on the podcast Josh Hammer. He is senior editor-at-large of Newsweek, where he also hosts the Josh Hammer Show podcast and syndicated radio show. He also writes a weekly newsletter, the Josh Hammer Report. His new book, Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. And you can follow him on X at Josh_Hammer. Hey, Josh, thanks for coming back on. Great to have you. I'd like to talk about the Trump cabinet picks here. We've got pretty much the whole portfolio now laid out here. Varying levels of controversy, it appears, surrounding different nominees. Let's begin on the foreign policy front, and specifically with the nominations of Rubio to be Secretary of State, Tulsi Gabbard to be the head of the national kind of intelligence apparatus. What is your take on Trump's appointments in the foreign policy domain? And then let's spell out the implications of it for Ukraine and possibly also for Israel.
Sure. So always great to join you, Dinesh. So Marco Rubio, I think, is a sensational pick for Department of State. So I live here in the state of Florida, where Marco Rubio, of course, is one of our senators. He is very eloquent about foreign affairs. He has always been very passionate about America's role in the world when it comes to foreign policy, and his general worldview, I think, very much comports with Donald Trump's worldview. You know, that itself is interesting, because I think when Marco Rubio first came onto the scene back in 2010 or so, he probably was slightly more in a Lindsey Graham, John McCain, old school neoconservative mold. But I think that as time has passed, he has found his views modulating a little bit towards Donald Trump's views a little bit more, especially in the Russia-Ukraine theater, which I find very interesting. But Marco Rubio's foreign policy worldview, Dinesh, I think fundamentally is very similar to Trump's, insofar as the foundational principle is the simplest and most straightforward principle in all of foreign policy, which is peace through strength. I mean, this is not a radical proposition. It is basically just common sense there. But the idea here is that if you demonstrate strength, if you project strength, ironically, you're actually not going to have to go to war as often as if you project weakness. It's really kind of just common sense there. You know, people say that some people say that he was a warmonger. Some people say that he was an isolationist. Really, Donald Trump's foreign policy in his first term, to me, was just good old-fashioned common sense. It was the notion that the United States should reward its friends and punish its enemies. On the foreign stage, that is. Ironically, the Democratic Party's foreign policy seems to be the exact opposite of that, where they reward our enemies and punish our friends. Funny how that works there. But I think Marco Rubio has this very simple, straightforward, commonsensical, and correct worldview there. So I think it's a very, very good pick as Secretary of State. Tulsi Gabbard, obviously a bit of an outsider. I mean, someone who has not kind of come up through the ranks of the so-called intelligence community. I say that is a very good thing. Why in the world would I want someone who has been a company man or a company woman, as the case may be, someone who has worn all the checkered uniforms and collected all the shiny gold stars there? I mean, we're dealing here with positions like National Security Advisor, DNI, FBI, NSA, CIA. I mean, this is the belly of the beast of the deep state, Dinesh, here. I mean, when we talk about the deep state, when we talk about the fact that Donald Trump just won a sweeping national election, he won all 7 swing states. He won states like Nevada for the first time since George W. Bush in 2004. This is a mandate. And the mandate for Donald Trump, above all else, has to do with making America great again by means of draining the swamp. Draining the swamp really is kind of, to me, that is the first and foremost MAGA imperative there. And there's a quote that goes back to H.L. Mencken, the newspaper columnist and social critic from the early 20th century. And it's always been one of my favorite quotes in American politics. I'm going to butcher it slightly, probably, but maybe not quite verbatim. But if I'm paraphrasing closely, this line from the old columnist H.L. Mencken is that democracy is the theory that the common man knows what he wants and he deserves to get it good and hard. And in this particular case, that means picks like Tulsi Gabbard at DNI. That means picks like Kash Patel at FBI there. Are we there to drain the swamp, Dinesh, or are we there to not drain the swamp? I think the question, frankly, answers itself.
Recently, Trump posted on Truth Social, and I'm paraphrasing now. He basically said, listen, you Hamas guys, or you guys who are holding all these hostages, you better start thinking about releasing them, because once I get there, there's going to be hell to pay. And I think we see right here a glimpse of how Trump operates. He's not an isolationist. He doesn't believe that, oh, that's Israel's problem over there. We should not be involved. On the contrary, he seems to think that projecting American power in a prudent but nevertheless, in some cases, overwhelming way is precisely the way to get things done, to help our allies, to stop the bad guys in the world. And so in this sense, Marco Rubio and maybe Tulsi Gabbard in a little different way will help Trump to carry out this idea in places like the Middle East and perhaps also in Ukraine.
Totally. So, look, one thing about Donald Trump's worldview and the conflict with Hamas in particular there. So, when October 7th happened, Dinesh, I think you and I both remember, there were some people who said, they pound their chest in somewhat of a triumphalist manner and say, America first, not my problem there. And I think part of the issue is that this is very short-sighted on the actual facts of what happened on October 7th in particular. And what I mean by that is that somewhere between 35 and 50 Americans were either killed and or taken hostage. In fact, the situation in Gaza for over a year now has been, on its own terms, the worst specifically American hostage crisis since Tehran in 1979. No one talks about this. No one talks about the fact that to this day, some of the hostages tragically rotting there in the subterranean terror tunnels in Gaza are actually American citizens. Yeah, I mean, if America first means anything whatsoever, I think it means that you're going to talk tough and ideally take tough action when it comes to jihadist, Islamist, civilizational enemies who are literally holding American citizens hostage. So Donald Trump, I think, intuits this, but more generally, I think Donald Trump's foreign policy worldview when it comes to Hamas, when it comes to Iran, when it comes to radical Islamism in general, frankly, I think he's coming from a place that I like to characterize as Jacksonian. This is a term that Walter Russell Mead popularized in a very famous essay for the National Interest magazine about 30 years ago or so, the 1990s. And it's referring to Andrew Jackson. And what it basically says is that, our instincts are not to be the world's policemen. We're not going to go around seeking to spread democracy. We're not going to make the U.S. Army necessarily the Peace Corps or anything like that. But if you mess with us, if you mess with our people, then we're going to punch back twice as hard, which is basically Donald Trump's MO in life. I mean, Donald Trump is not necessarily going to take the first swing at him, but if you swing at him, he's going to come back really hard at you there. And we saw that repeatedly throughout his presidency. I mean, when he took out Qasem Soleimani, the arch IRGC Iranian terrorist at the Baghdad, Iraq airport in January 2020, that was coming from a Jacksonian starting place, I might say there. And I think his foreign policy is basically exactly right. And his picks thus far definitely genuinely give me confidence. I think Michael Waltz is also a great pick, a national security advisor there. Pete Hegseth, I think, has the same worldview. I personally hope that his nomination gets through as Secretary of Defense. He's being embattled right now. I think it's a very inspired pick. I happen to be a huge fan of Pete Hegseth as the pick actually there. So I really like the way that all of these foreign policy picks are coming together there. And ideally, obviously, Donald Trump gets into power come January 20th, and then he is able to actually make America great again, not just on the home front, but also on the global stage as well.
It's interesting, Josh, that there has been so much pushback on Hegseth. And I say that because the other pushbacks I understand more clearly. Like, I understand why the kind of apologists for the police state are freaked out about Kash Patel, let's say, at the FBI, because they know what Kash is going to do when he gets there. I also understand why people like RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard are threatening to the kind of media establishment and some of the Never Trumpers and so on. Now, I'm a little surprised at the venom with which they're going after Pete Hegseth. And I mean to the degree of like excavating his mother's email. And the latest thing is even more comical. I mean, there's a news report that on St. Patrick's Day, after he finished his show, he had some beers. And I'm like, you think you're going to, this is supposed to be incriminating? So, look, I mean, Pete's lived an up and down life, which he's admitted to, and he's sort of admitted that he's reformed in a number of these areas, and he had some serious problems with marriage and so on. But none of this would seem to be adequate. I guess the question I'm asking you is, where is the antagonism to Hegseth coming from? What is it about Hegseth that scares them so much?
So first of all, Dinesh, last I checked, both of the great religions that founded our country and our civilization, Judaism and Christianity, believe in atonement and repentance. I mean, these are core tenets, frankly, of both of those major Abrahamic religions there. And from what I understand, Pete Hegseth is now very involved with his church. He and his wife, they have multiple kids there. I genuinely get the sense that he has reformed his life from his ways in the past. So I think that we as Americans really should not necessarily be judging people for what happened, 5-10 years ago, as long as they have demonstrably repented and atoned and changed their course, which we have every reason to believe that Pete Hegseth has done. So let me just first stipulate that. As far as why exactly the venom is coming out for Pete Hegseth, I think it's because of his biography, essentially. And what I mean by that is he is 44 years old. This is a man who is a veteran of multiple post-9/11 wars overseas. He served in Iraq. He served in Afghanistan. And specifically, he has seen, I think, with very clear eyes, the shortcomings and the pitfalls of America's post-9/11 foreign policy, whereby we are engaged in a lot of moralistic boondoggles overseas. I mean, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya would be a very good example of that. I mean, this notion that America goes in with some ideological mission to try to spread democracy and to try to sculpt Madisonian, Lockean Enlightenment liberal utopias out of third world Islamist hellholes. I mean, this is a fundamentally failed endeavor, and I think Pete Hegseth has quite literally lived that out. Nonetheless, there are a lot of entrenched interests, both within the Pentagon bureaucracy and in the military-industrial complex more generally when it comes to the contractors. I mean, a lot of people profit from war, Dinesh. I mean, this is not exactly a new insight. Dwight D. Eisenhower famously referred to it, in his farewell address there. So, I mean, this has been a theme of American politics for more than half a century now, but especially in our post-9/11 milieu, I think Pete Hegseth has lived this out in a way that I think really, really, really grinds the gears of a lot of people there. And I think that above all really is probably why you're seeing this venom coming from certain quarters.
Let's talk in the time we have left about the Kash Patel nomination, because it seems to me that this is maybe the ultimate kind of up yours from Trump, right? In other words, the FBI was the instrument of raiding Mar-a-Lago. The FBI is the goon squad that has gone after the January 6th protesters. I mean, this has been the enforcement arm of the DOJ, and I think has shown unusual insensitivity and brutality. And by that, I mean going to Mar-a-Lago with orders to use lethal force if necessary, doing these dawn raids on, 75-year-old grandmothers. For what purpose other than to discombobulate them, terrorize them? Now, look, if your job is to arrest them, go to their front door, invite them to come in and turn themselves in. There is a sense in which they have been using this shock and awe, not on our enemies abroad, but on their domestic political enemies. And Trump seems to be saying, I'm going to really shake this place up, and shake it up not just by swapping out a few people at the top, but by kind of fumigating it from the top down. I think that's what Cash's nomination represents. Do you agree with that? And also, do you think that Cash is going to make it through?
So, Dinesh, earlier when I was quoting H.L. Mencken and saying that, this is a mandate and the people, they deserve it good and hard. I mean, Kash Patel really is the pick that I think embodies that and personifies that more than anything. But the reason for that is because the FBI, more than any agency in the entire federal government, is the literal embodiment of the deep state that has been trying to thwart Donald Trump and his agenda, literally going back to before he was president the first time, going back to the 2016 campaign. I mean, it was the FBI that was ground zero for Kevin Kleinsmith fudging a FISA warrant in order to spy on Carter Page and George Papadopoulos. It was the FBI where Jim Comey famously got on his high horse in the summer of 2016 and said that, quote, no reasonable prosecutor would prosecute Hillary Clinton for her 33,000 emails on her server at home there. It was the FBI that had the Bob Mueller report, which, of course, handicapped the administration for literally almost 2.5 years, more than half of the administration the first time around. It was the FBI that was involved with the Hunter Biden laptop censorship, the Gretchen Whitmer fake kidnapping plot, January 6th, as you mentioned there. Of course, the raid on Mar-a-Lago. So, I mean, the FBI just over and over and over again has proven itself to be an instrument of those who wish Donald Trump and his allies and supporters harm. So I am not the least bit surprised that he did that which I and many others called for him to do, which is to nominate Kash Patel there. The good news is that I think that Kash Patel actually is going to make it through. So we have the Article 3 project where I'm senior counsel, Dinesh. We've actually been very active hitting the phone to action on our platform there. We've gotten a ton of our grassroots supporters there to call their senators there, say that they want Kash Patel there. And what I'm hearing from Trump world more generally is that it's looking very good. In fact, as it currently stands, and I'm not necessarily known for my counting votes in the U.S. Senate, but as it currently stands there, I don't necessarily predict that he's going to lose a single vote at this point there. So I'm actually quite confident that he's going to get his pick. The only question, I think, is whether or not Christopher Wray does the honorable thing and resigns, or whether or not Donald Trump has to fire him, which he might end up having to do that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that because there has been some talk about, Christopher Wray has been appointed on a 10-year term, but it's quite clear both from precedent as well as from the actual rules of the DOJ that it's completely at Trump's discretion whether or not to keep Christopher Wray on. And so it's going to be just, to me, one of the more spectacular aspects of this new administration to see what Kash can do inside of that operation of the FBI. Guys, I've been talking to Josh Hammer, senior editor of Newsweek. Follow him on X at Josh_Hammer. Look for the book, Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. Josh, thank you very much for joining me.
It's always a pleasure, Dinesh. Thank you.
I'm discussing The Big Lie, and I finished a short examination of Giovanni Gentile, the philosopher of fascism, and now I am discussing the issue of theory and practice. The theoretical ideas of fascism, or let's call it fascism in speech, and then the practical implementation of those ideas, which could be called fascism in deed. Now, the left-wing progressive historian Robert Paxton says that even though when you read the doctrines of the fascists, it sounds very left-wing, he says, quote, when you read Mussolini's first program in 1919, when you read Hitler's program, it had very little to do with what they eventually did. So Paxton's point appears to be that you can't equate fascism and National Socialism with the left because Mussolini and Hitler did not actually implement the full scope of their ideological platforms or programs. But I think that this argument makes no sense because all theories have to accommodate the realities of the situation. And this doesn't undermine the theory as a vision of how things ought to be. Trump has a vision. Trump has an ideology. He may not get everything he wants. He's going to try to get as much of it as he can, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't believe those things, or it doesn't mean that his beliefs aren't really MAGA. Imagine if you made the argument, well, Trump isn't really MAGA because MAGA wasn't really able to implement all its doctrines. Well, the translation of ideas into practice depends on the situation, depends on the margin that you have in the House and the Senate, and the political environment in which you have to push your ideas forward. Lincoln was anti-slavery, but he needed to keep the border states in the Union. And so his Emancipation Proclamation didn't free all the slaves. It only freed the slaves who were in areas controlled by the Confederacy. Now, to point this out is not to say that Lincoln wasn't anti-slavery. Of course he was. But simply to say that he implemented his anti-slavery ideas to the degree that the circumstances allowed. Consider also the example of Lenin. Lenin was a dedicated Marxist. Who would say otherwise? He's almost a definition of a dedicated Marxist revolutionary. And yet, when Lenin came to power in the 1920s, the Soviet economy ground to a complete halt. Lenin realized that this is absolutely disastrous. And so he said, I need to embrace some measures to alleviate the problem. What does he do? He starts moving in a more capitalist direction. He allows private property, he allows private farms, he allows businesses and farms to keep some of their earnings. He encourages foreign business to invest in the Soviet Union. This was what Lenin called his NEP, or his new economic policy. So it was a temporary pivot away from socialism to enable Lenin to restore the economy, at least partially, and consolidate his hold on power. Now, we're going to focus in on Mussolini, who was the kind of founder, the originator, the first apostle, if you will, the first person to implement fascism and take control of a major state, in this case, of course, Italy. Let's remember that Mussolini came to power in 1922, a full 11 years before Hitler. Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, and Hitler revered Mussolini. Ultimately, Hitler realized that Germany is a much bigger and stronger power than Mussolini. So once World War II began, Mussolini was kind of a junior partner to Hitler, but Mussolini got there first. He was the original fascist despot. And Mussolini was, as I mentioned before, a left-winger. He was so left-wing that, and such a collectivist, that he was the one who popularized the idea of totalitarianism as a positive idea. Now, for Mussolini, totalitarianism didn't mean what we take it to mean today. We take it to mean, because we read totalitarianism very much through the lens of Orwell, Solzhenitsyn. So you can think of totalitarianism now as a jackboot stamping on a human face. This was the memorable description of it in Orwell's 1984. But Mussolini didn't see it that way. He said totalitarianism means that the state looks after you in every respect. Totalitarianism is a kind of total supervisory role played by the state. And Mussolini saw it as a positive thing, and also kind of as something very Italian. Now, as I hinted yesterday, Mussolini was very Italian, and his totalitarianism was never implemented with the same kind of determination or ruthlessness as it was in Hitler's Germany. To give you a simple example, throughout the reign of Mussolini, you were allowed to leave Italy. So right there, you have an issue. If a state is truly totalitarian, it's not going to let people leave, because it's not going to allow an escape hatch. It's going to make sure that you are under control. Or even if it lets you leave, it's going to make sure that it controls you wherever you go. Look at the way, for example, that China today, which does allow some people to leave, but nevertheless keeps an eye on them no matter where they go. And so Mussolini, in this sense, was not a kind of full-blown totalitarian. totalitarian, even though he embraced a full-blown totalitarianism in his ideology. What about Mussolini's socialism? Now, if you look at his original socialist program, it's called the Fasci di Combattimento. He released in Milan in 1919. This is the Mussolini platform: universal suffrage, lowering the voting age to 18, abolishing the elitist Senate, mandating an 8-hour workday, massive public works programs, worker participation in industrial management, nationalization of all defense-related industries, and it goes on like this. And I think you can see right away, this is a platform that, while not identical with, resembles the platform of the progressive left today. All these items could easily be seen. It wouldn't even raise an eyebrow if they were in the Democratic National Committee program. Now, Mussolini was able to get some of this implemented when he became the head of Italy. And in fact, Mussolini, while doing these things, even said explicitly that what he was doing didn't merely resemble the New Deal, which was, by the way, going on at the same time in the early 1930s in America under FDR, but Mussolini presented his fascism as more progressive, more advanced, going further than FDR's New Deal. And yet, there were, as with the New Deal, large elements of private enterprise that remained in Italy and remained, of course, in America. And of course, the reason for this, again, is that neither FDR nor Mussolini had absolute power. Mussolini, in this sense, was not Hitler. He was not Stalin. He was appointed by the king, which is Emmanuel III, and the king had the power to remove him. And eventually he did. Now, while Mussolini was in power, in the beginning, he had to work with institutions that he didn't like. He didn't like the Catholic Church, but he had to work with the church. He made a concordat, a kind of an agreement, a peace treaty, if you will, with the Catholic Church. His own power waxed and waned while he was the ruler. He did become the absolute ruler for a time, particularly at the height of his power, which was in the mid-1930s. And then, of course, World War II broke out, and once that happened, as I mentioned, Mussolini was a kind of second fiddle to Hitler. In fact, Mussolini modified his programs so that they were more in line with Hitler. Mussolini even, I think to his discredit, embraced a partial racism and anti-Semitism, which he didn't really believe in, he didn't really enforce, but nevertheless he did it in order to sort of bring himself into sync or into line with the National Socialism in Germany. In 1943, Mussolini was kicked out. He was ousted from power, but in an incredibly daring rescue, the Germans rescued Mussolini from the Allies. Remember, the Allies by this time had landed already in Italy, and but Hitler rescued Mussolini, brought him to Germany, and then sent him back to run a small territory called Salo. And here Mussolini was truly lord of his own kingdom. He could do whatever he wanted, and guess what he does? He says, okay, well here, now that I can finally do what I want, I'm going to have true socialism. So he brought in this deputy, a guy named Ugo Spirito, and the first thing that they started doing is abolishing all private property in Salo. They decided that all decisions by private enterprise had to be submitted to management committees that would be overseen by the public sector. So basically, a more full-blown socialism than Mussolini was ever able to establish in the entire region of Italy. Mussolini also brought in another advisor, a guy named Nicola Bombacci. And this guy, believe it or not, was a close friend of Lenin. He had been the founder of the Italian Communist Party. So you see right away how fascism and communism are side by side, working together. And Mussolini remained unto his death a dedicated statist and a dedicated socialist. So looking up close at Mussolini, at what he did, using the power that was available to him, we see that he implemented as much of socialism as he was able to do until he was deposed. and ultimately finally assassinated, and his body displayed in the piazza, I believe in Milan. And that was the sorry end that Mussolini came to. When we pick this up on Monday, tomorrow is my roundup with Debbie, so I won't do the big lie, but I'll pick it up on Monday, and I will now pivot from Mussolini to National Socialism, which is to say to Nazism.
Subscribe to the Dinesh D'Souza podcast on Apple, Google, and Spotify, or watch on Rumble, YouTube, and SalemNow.com.